A racist and corrupt police officer ordered the handcuffing of an elderly black woman, completely unaware that the woman he was humiliating in public was, in fact, a justice of the United States Supreme Court. And what happened to that officer afterward shook the entire nation. It was supposed to be a normal morning. Just another routine day in front of a federal building. A hot sun beating down on the pavement, passers-by in suits and heels, everything ticking like clockwork, until it didn't. In front of one of the most important judicial institutions in the country, a woman with silvered hair, dressed modestly and walking with the quiet strength of someone who's seen too much, paused at the gate. She reached into her bag, searching for her ID badge, the one that would open the doors of the highest court in the nation, but it wasn't there. Her expression shifted. Calm, but momentarily puzzled. Before she could explain to the security guard, a call had already gone out to the police, suspicious elderly black female attempting to access restricted area. Minutes later, tires screeched. 2 patrol cars arrived like it was an armed robbery. Uniformed men got out. But only one approached. The one with too much pride in his walk and hatred in his eyes. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to understand. He just looked at her and saw what he wanted to see, someone who didn't belong. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, voice slicing through the air. "You're not supposed to be here." She tried to speak, tried to explain. "I'm a federal official. I simply forgot my badge," he cut her off, laughing bitterly. "Yeah. And I'm the damn president. Turn around, now. You people are always trying something." The other officers hesitated, unsure, shifting uncomfortably. Something didn't feel right. But the leading officer didn't care. He pushed her forward, yanked her arms behind her back with a force far too violent for someone her age. Her shoulder cracked. She gasped, but didn't scream. The people passing by stopped. Some pulled out phones. Most just stared, silent, either too afraid or too conditioned to interfere. "I said stop resisting," he yelled, even though she wasn't moving at all. "This is what happens when you think the law doesn't apply to you." The crowd watched as an old black woman, calm, dignified, proud, was shoved into the back of a squad car like a common criminal. No one knew who she was. Not yet. But what they had all just witnessed was more than a mistake. It was more than an incident. It was a symbol. A brutal reminder of how deep systemic racism still runs. That a black woman, no matter how powerful, how accomplished, could be reduced in seconds to just another suspect in the eyes of a man who wore the badge not to serve, but to dominate. And that badge, ironically, was supposed to be under her authority. Inside the police station, the reality began to unravel. There was confusion. Quiet whispers between officers. Cross-checks in the system. Files opened. Names searched. And then, silence. Heavy. The kind that crushes lungs and tightens throats. The chief of police walked in, his face pale. "You need to uncuff her. Now. You need to apologize. That woman is not just a federal official. She is one of the 9 justices of the United States Supreme Court." The room froze. The arresting officer scoffed. "What? You're kidding. That woman? She's just, there's no way." But the evidence was right in front of him. A dozen documents. Photos. Videos. News headlines. Her face, powerful and wise, staring back at him from a screen. That moment, the look in his eyes when he realized, wasn't just fear. It was the unraveling of every belief he'd wrapped himself in. He had built a career off the illusion of authority, off the comfort of impunity, off the idea that people like her didn't matter. And in an instant, everything flipped. But what came next, that's what no one was ready for. She didn't yell. She didn't demand revenge. She sat, back straight, and asked to speak to his commanding officer. Calm, composed, but with a presence that bent the air around her. The officer who had just humiliated her stood before her, suddenly so small, sweating, mumbling half-formed apologies. "You don't even know who you're hurting when you act like this," she said, voice low but thunderous. "But today, you'll find out." Her return to the court was not quiet. Word had spread. The video leaked. News outlets flooded in. A nation that had grown numb to outrage stopped and paid attention. Because this wasn't just another statistic. This wasn't another case that would be buried or forgotten. This was justice itself being dragged in handcuffs across a courthouse sidewalk. And she knew exactly what to do with that spotlight. The hearings began. And the man who had tried to humiliate her now stood on the other side of the bench. She didn't have to fight dirty. She didn't have to threaten or scream. She let the law speak. She let the facts be revealed. She allowed the country to see everything, the past complaints, the hidden records, the racist remarks that had been ignored by his superiors. One by one, the masks came off. But the true reckoning? That came when the president made a surprise announcement on national television. A new federal task force to root out corruption and racial abuse in law enforcement. And at the head of that task force, her. The same woman who had been handcuffed like a criminal was now in charge of deciding the fate of every officer accused of abuse of power, including him. And now, the nation waited. Waited to see what she would do. Would she retaliate? Would she seek vengeance? Or would she find a way to show that justice isn't about emotion, it's about principle? That woman had already lost her dignity once, right there on the sidewalk. But what she reclaimed afterward was something no one could ever take from her again. But here's the question that has every newsroom, every politician, every American holding their breath: when the judge who was wronged becomes the one who decides the punishment, what does true justice look like? And more importantly, what did she choose to do with that power? Stick around. Because the twist is coming. Before we begin, we want to send a clear message to every black viewer watching this video: you matter. Your life, your dignity, and your story deserve respect. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in all its forms. This channel is a space for truth, for justice, and for powerful stories that reflect the realities too often ignored. We hope this story speaks to your heart. If you believe in narratives that empower and expose, subscribe now and join our community. Enjoy the story. The morning sun over Washington, D.C. cast long golden shadows across the marble steps of the Supreme Court, just a few blocks away from a scene that would soon shake the nation. It was a typical weekday downtown: suits rushing past food trucks, cyclists weaving through traffic, and federal buildings standing tall like silent sentinels of democracy. Among the crowd moving with purpose and confidence, there walked a woman whose presence commanded quiet respect even in the absence of spectacle. Her name was Judge Angela Harmon. To some, she was known simply as Justice Harmon. But long before titles or robes, Angela had been just another little black girl growing up in the rougher edges of Atlanta, where she learned fast that the world wouldn't give her anything she didn't fight for. Angela was in her early 70s now, though she carried herself with a poise and elegance that seemed immune to time. Her hair, a crown of tight silver curls, was worn unapologetically natural. She dressed with a simplicity that belied her power, today in a deep navy pantsuit and comfortable flats. She didn't need opulence. Her authority was felt in her silence, in the firmness of her gaze, in the way her words held weight. Every inch of her told a story, not of privilege, but of perseverance. Her life was a slow-burning testament to what it meant to rise in a world not built for you, and her role in the Supreme Court was more than a seat at the table, it was a symbol of victory carved from 1,000 small losses along the way. Her childhood had been marked by the civil rights movement. She remembered clinging to her mother's skirt as marches echoed through her neighborhood and learning what the word segregation meant before she could spell it. Her father, a pastor, was wrongly accused of theft when she was 10, dragged from their church in handcuffs in front of the congregation. That memory never left her. It didn't make her bitter, but it did make her resolute. She pursued law not because she believed in the system, but because she believed the system had to change, and it would never change without people like her inside it. Angela had graduated top of her class at Howard University, where she'd been both revered and underestimated. She worked her way through every level of the judicial system, public defender, circuit judge, appellate court, until a nomination to the Supreme Court brought her into the national spotlight. Her confirmation hearings had been brutal, with veiled language and passive-aggressive challenges to her credentials. But she didn't flinch. She responded with intellect sharper than any insult, and grace that made her critics look small. Over the years, she had earned the respect of even her ideological opposites. She was known for being fair, deliberate, deeply principled, and unshakable. But power doesn't make you invisible to prejudice. Not when you're a black woman. Not in America. That morning, Angela had left her home in Capitol Hill a bit distracted. Her mind was on a pending case, one involving police misconduct and racial profiling, and in the rush of thought, she had forgotten her badge. It was rare for her to walk to the court building without an escort or driver, but she had chosen that day to take the long way, walking alone through the streets that had become familiar over the years. She wanted clarity. Time to think. She had done it countless times before without issue. But today, the small absence of a plastic ID card would lead to the most humiliating moment of her professional life. Across the city, Officer Brian Cutler was finishing his third coffee and staring out the window of his patrol car parked near the federal buildings. He was a 10-year veteran of the D.C. police force, stationed in the area due to his excellent record, though internally he was known for his aggressive policing tactics. Brian was the kind of man who took every challenge personally and viewed authority as a weapon to be used rather than a responsibility to be upheld. His reputation among his colleagues was split. Some admired his assertiveness, while others quietly documented his infractions and kept their heads down. He was a white man in his mid-40s, stocky with a buzzcut and a chip on his shoulder, especially when it came to anyone who questioned his dominance. He had grown up in the outskirts of Philadelphia, raised by a father who referred to the civil rights era as the good old days of order. Brian joined the force straight out of community college, and though he had faced disciplinary action for his conduct more than once, he had always been shielded by a thin blue wall of silence and technicalities. That morning, when the call came over the radio about a suspicious older black woman loitering outside the Supreme Court building without ID, Brian reacted with instinct rather than inquiry. He didn't ask for further details. He didn't think. He simply drove. He believed he knew exactly what kind of person he'd find, and that belief, unchecked and corrupted by years of prejudice, would be the beginning of his undoing. Angela stood at the building's entrance, calmly explaining to a young security guard that she had forgotten her credentials but could provide verbal verification. She was patient, kind even, despite the frustration beginning to bubble inside her. She understood that people were just doing their jobs. But when Brian arrived and exited his patrol car with swagger and suspicion in his eyes, everything changed. He approached her with the kind of energy meant to intimidate, not question, not investigate, just dominate. He saw her calm demeanor as defiance. He interpreted her explanation as arrogance. He asked for ID, and when she told him she had none on her, he smirked. "So what are you, some kind of lawyer?" he said, not realizing how ironic that question would later become. "Or are you just trying to pull something?" Angela kept her voice measured. "I'm a federal official. I work here. I simply left my badge at home." He rolled his eyes, scoffing. "You expect me to believe that? Lady, I've seen your type before. Always thinkin' you're above the law." The guard tried to interject, but Brian waved him off, stepping closer. His hand moved toward his belt. The other officers lingered behind, unsure whether to intervene or let him handle it his way. It was clear this wasn't about procedure anymore, it was about pride. Brian wanted to put someone in cuffs that day, and he had decided it would be her. Without further warning, he grabbed Angela by the wrist. The moment she instinctively pulled back, he called it resisting. Her other arm was twisted behind her, the sharp metal of the cuffs biting into her skin. He shoved her toward the cruiser while her voice remained calm, still trying to explain, still trying to believe this wasn't really happening. But it was. She was forced into the back of the police car with onlookers standing in stunned silence, too afraid to speak. Inside the station, Angela sat in a holding room, her wrists bruised and her dignity shattered. She had spent her life defending the law, protecting it, shaping it, only to be reduced in moments to nothing more than a threat in the eyes of a man who couldn't see past her skin. But she wasn't angry. Not yet. She was heartbroken. Not for herself, but for every person who didn't have her platform, her position, her voice. And while she waited quietly, Brian boasted outside the room, telling colleagues how he caught a trespasser, trying to fake her way into the Supreme Court. His words were laced with smugness, blind to the storm about to tear through his life. Because in a few minutes, someone would check the records. Someone would recognize her. Someone would realize exactly who was sitting silently behind that steel door. And when that moment came, everything would begin to unravel. But none of that had happened yet. All that existed now was the humiliation. The unjust pain. The gutting sense that no matter how high a black woman climbs, someone will still try to drag her down. And Angela sat, waiting, not for rescue, not for pity, but for the moment when truth would walk into the room. Because justice has a long memory. And karma never forgets a face. The air inside the precinct had shifted. There was no siren, no alarm, but the silence had turned heavy, as if even the walls were holding their breath. The officer at the desk, a young Latina named Torres, had typed in the woman's full name out of habit, not truly expecting anything to come up. Her eyes moved from the screen to the door of the holding room, then back to the screen. Her fingers froze. Her mouth opened slightly. And then came a quiet, almost disbelieving whisper, "Oh my God." The badge number on the file. The federal clearance. The official portraits. And that name. Justice Angela Harmon. A Supreme Court justice. In their holding room. In handcuffs. Torres stood up so quickly her chair toppled backward. She didn't call out, didn't scream. She walked fast, like she was chasing her own breath, until she found Sergeant Matthews. He looked up from his coffee, annoyed. "What now?" She showed him the screen. The color drained from his face. Inside the holding room, Angela remained composed, though her wrists throbbed and her back ached from the cold metal bench. She had refused the offer of water earlier, not out of pride, but because she didn't want to accept anything until someone recognized her for who she was, and what had been done to her. Her hands rested folded in her lap, her spine straight. She wasn't a prisoner. She was a witness. A witness to her own mistreatment. Sergeant Matthews opened the door with careful urgency, his face attempting to mask the panic underneath. He looked at her, now seeing her for the first time, not as a suspect, but as a symbol. His voice cracked slightly. "Justice Harmon, ma'am. We deeply apologize. There's been a terrible mistake. Please, let me get those off of you right away." Angela didn't move. Mistake is a generous word for what happened. He swallowed. "Yes, ma'am. You're absolutely right. We're contacting the chief. He's on his way here now. Please, allow me to help." Only then did she offer her wrists, her eyes never leaving his. There was no rage in her gaze. Just something far more unsettling, clarity. She saw everything. The cowardice. The scrambling. The shame that only arrived after the realization of power. The moment the cuffs were off, she stood slowly, stretching her arms, rotating her shoulders. She didn't thank him. That courtesy had expired. In another room, Brian Cutler was still bragging to his partner, Jenkins, about how he'd caught some phony trying to breach a federal building, when Matthews came storming in like a thundercloud. "You. Office. Now." His voice was steel. Brian blinked, confused. "What's going on?" "You just detained a sitting U.S. Supreme Court justice, you goddamn idiot." The blood drained from Brian's face. "What? That old lady? No way. She didn't have ID, she was being suspicious, she was resisting." Matthews slammed a folder on the desk in front of him. "Does that look like someone who needs to fake her way into a government building? That's Justice Angela Harmon. You put her in cuffs. You shoved her into your cruiser. In public. While cameras were rolling." Brian stammered, his voice now an uneven stutter of justifications. But she didn't look like what?" Matthews cut in, voice now thunder. "Like someone who belongs. Like someone who could sit on the highest court in the land. Say it. Say what you mean." The room was silent again. Angela was escorted out of the precinct with a quiet dignity that made even the janitor pause his mop. Reporters hadn't gotten there yet. But they would. Oh, they would. She didn't make a statement. She didn't need to. The sight of her leaving in silence, shoulders back, eyes forward, said more than any press conference could. That evening, in her home, she sat at the edge of her bed, her body tired but her mind burning. Not with rage. But with resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. She thought of the thousands, no, millions, who didn't have the platform she had. The teenagers pulled over for looking like a threat. The mothers questioned for walking in neighborhoods too rich for their skin tone. The boys slammed against hoods for matching a vague description. The countless others who never had cameras to bear witness, whose stories were never told. She met with her advisors the next day. No theatrics. No vengeance. Only strategy. They discussed protocol, precedent, ethics. She listened. Nodded. But her mind was already past policy. She was crafting something larger. Something systemic. A response that wouldn't just punish, but expose. Illuminate. Correct. Meanwhile, Brian was being torn apart online. Someone in the crowd had uploaded the arrest footage. It had gone viral within hours. The hashtags were trending. Hashtag Justice Harmon, hashtag handcuffed justice, hashtag know her name. His photo was everywhere, plastered on screens, dissected in panel discussions, torn apart in tweets. His prior disciplinary records resurfaced. 3 complaints. 2 settlements. 1 internal memo about implicit bias training recommended but not completed. Now, it all mattered. Now, people were watching. At the station, things got colder. Jenkins stopped talking to him. Torres wouldn't meet his eyes. His supervisor wouldn't even let him back on the street. He was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. But it wasn't the suspension that broke him, it was the silence. The way the halls had shifted around him. The looks that said we knew you'd fall eventually. Angela gave no interviews. Her silence only amplified the storm. But the real tension was still to come. The White House called. Not once. Not twice. But several times. The president's team was gravely concerned about the incident and eager to show support. The Attorney General wanted to meet. And then, a closed-door invitation, a task force. National. Permanent. Focused on law enforcement reform and racial accountability. And they wanted her to lead it. Angela didn't say yes immediately. She needed to think. Not about the optics or the politics, but about the weight of such a choice. It would mean facing men like Brian Cutler every single day. It would mean enduring the endless pushback from unions, lobbyists, senators. But it would also mean doing what she had always sworn to do, uphold justice. even when it burned. Back in Brian's house, the tension grew. His wife stopped speaking to him. His teenage daughter posted on social media, "Maybe now Dad will see what I've been trying to tell him." She didn't delete it. His union offered a statement, lukewarm support, carefully worded. His lawyer advised him to lay low. But he couldn't sleep. Not with the world watching. Not with her face on every screen. Angela, meanwhile, prepared for a hearing, one that would be televised nationwide. Not a trial. Not yet. But a formal review of police conduct that would include testimony, data, and, eventually, recommendations. She requested no special treatment. She didn't want flowers or apologies or ceremonies. She wanted change. Systemic. Uncomfortable. Permanent. And Brian? He was subpoenaed. He was going to have to sit across from her, live on national television, and answer for what he did. Not just to her, but to the badge. To the oath. To the people watching. The days leading up to the hearing were tense. Protesters gathered on both sides. Some defended him, claiming he was just doing his job. Others demanded his badge, his resignation, his head. The city trembled with anticipation. The media speculated endlessly, would she go after him publicly? Would she destroy him? Would she forgive him? And more importantly, what would this mean for law enforcement in America? Angela remained quiet. She spent the night before the hearing writing alone in her study. Not a speech. But something more personal. A letter. To herself. To the girl who watched her father get cuffed in church. To every black child told to keep their hands visible. To every officer who had ever been told that bias didn't exist. She folded the letter and placed it in her bag. Tomorrow, she would face the man who tried to break her dignity. And he would have to answer, not just to her, but to a nation ready to listen. Because justice was coming. The lights inside the congressional hearing room were brighter than usual, casting a sterile, unforgiving glare across every polished surface. Rows of spectators filled the chamber, journalists, activists, legal scholars, law enforcement personnel, politicians with too many cameras pointed at them. The room held its breath in anticipation. On the elevated bench sat Justice Angela Harmon, appointed special chair of the newly formed National Commission on Law Enforcement Accountability. Her face, composed and unreadable, was broadcast live to millions watching across the country. This wasn't just another hearing. This was a reckoning. And at the center of it, called to testify before her and the commission, was Officer Brian Cutler. He entered the room quietly, trying to shrink his presence, but it was impossible. Everyone knew his name. He looked older than he had weeks ago, his face weathered not by time but by consequence. He wore a suit that didn't fit quite right and carried the rigid posture of a man trying desperately to appear in control. He had shaved, but the nervous twitch in his jaw betrayed him. He didn't look at Angela. Not yet. His lawyer followed him closely, whispering something inaudible before stepping aside. Angela remained silent as he was sworn in. Her eyes never left him. Not with malice. But with something much heavier, expectation. A silence fell as she leaned forward, adjusting the microphone in front of her. "Officer Cutler," she began, her voice steady, smooth, and surgical, "on the morning of April 3rd, you detained an individual outside a federal building. Please explain the justification for your actions." He cleared his throat, voice dry. The suspect, the individual in question matched a report of someone attempting unauthorized entry. She had no identification and, she interrupted, not rudely, but precisely. Did she exhibit threatening behavior? No, but, did she resist arrest? He hesitated. She questioned my authority. Angela's gaze sharpened. So questioning authority is grounds for physical restraint? He looked away, gripping the edge of the desk. It's not that simple. Please explain what makes it complex. There was a pause. A long one. Brian's mouth opened but no words came out at first. The room was silent, save for the faint scratching of pens and the click of camera shutters. Finally, he spoke. I made assumptions. I thought she didn't belong there. I didn't recognize her, and I acted too fast. I should have listened. I see that now. Angela nodded once. She let the silence return, let the weight of his words sink in, not just to him, but to every officer watching. She could feel the attention of the nation pressing down on her shoulders, but she didn't flinch. I appreciate your acknowledgement, she said calmly. But this hearing is not only about your mistake. It's about understanding how someone with your record, 3 prior complaints, 2 settlements, and a recommendation for bias training you never completed, was allowed to remain on duty. We are here to examine that failure. And we will. Brian sat still, hands clenched in his lap. But then, unexpectedly, Angela shifted the direction of her questioning. I'd like to ask you something outside your written statement, she said, her voice slightly softer. Do you remember what you said to me that morning? He closed his eyes briefly, as if hoping the moment would disappear. Yes. Repeat it. He hesitated. Ma'am, repeat it, she said again, firmer now. Not for me. For the record. For the people watching. He exhaled slowly. I said. You people are always trying something. A quiet gasp rippled through the audience. Angela didn't blink. And now, Officer Cutler, she continued, what do you think, you people, means to the millions of Americans who look like me? His voice cracked. I don't know. I didn't mean, but you said it. Because you believed it. Because somewhere inside, that bias lives. And that is the problem. The silence was suffocating. Even his lawyer sat motionless. Angela leaned back, letting the words echo. She didn't have to yell. Her calm dismantled more than rage ever could. And then she revealed what no one in the room expected. With one hand, she reached into her folder and pulled out a copy of a federal memorandum. She read aloud its first line. Effective immediately, Officer Brian Cutler is the first subject of a full federal investigation by the National Task Force on Law Enforcement Integrity. There was movement in the room, reporters typing frantically, cameras adjusting focus, audience members murmuring. Brian's face drained of color. But that's not all, Angela continued. This task force, under my leadership, will audit every department where prior bias complaints were dismissed or silenced. We will open the records. We will revisit every buried case. Then came the final twist. Angela turned to address the panel beside her. And in accordance with federal oversight powers, the Commission has voted unanimously to refer Officer Cutler's case for criminal investigation regarding falsification of reports and obstruction of justice in a separate, previously closed case involving an underage suspect. Gasps erupted. Brian's head shot up. What are you talking about? That case was dropped, Angela stared at him. Dropped because you lied. We have the footage now. From a whistleblower inside your own precinct. The room exploded with questions from the press. Brian turned toward his lawyer, eyes wild, hands shaking. But the lawyer looked at him coldly now, betrayed by the one client he had defended without knowing the full truth. Angela closed the folder slowly, signaling that she had finished. But then she paused, looking directly into the camera. To the people watching at home, she said, voice clear and commanding, this is not about revenge. This is about accountability. It's about recognizing that no one, no badge, no bench, no title, is above the law. What happened to me is not unique. It happens every day to people whose names you'll never hear. And today, we start correcting that. She stood up. The room followed. Not because they were told to. But because justice had risen. Brian remained seated, pale, trembling, surrounded by silence he could no longer hide behind. The narrative he had believed in, the illusion of control, of being untouchable, was crumbling. And as Angela walked out of the chamber, head high, shoulders unshaken, one question remained hanging in the air, on every tongue, in every mind: what happens when the person you try to silence becomes the one who decides your fate? The answer, it seemed, was just beginning to unfold. As the hearing room slowly emptied and reporters scrambled to deliver breaking news updates outside the Capitol building, inside the marble halls of justice, the air was still electric. The tension hadn't subsided, it had only changed shape. Justice Angela Harmon remained in the chamber a little longer, standing near the bench, her fingertips lightly brushing the edge of the polished wood. Her heart didn't race, her breath didn't tremble. She was steady. But what she carried now wasn't just the outcome of a hearing. It was the weight of all those who never had one. She looked up at the gallery, now mostly empty, and imagined the faces of those mothers, brothers, children who had cried out for accountability and were met with silence. Today wasn't just about her. It never had been. Outside the courtroom, Brian Cutler sat alone in a side room that smelled faintly of coffee and panic. His lawyer had stepped out to make a call, and for the first time in years, Brian had no one to talk over him, no badge to hide behind, no system to mute the echo of his own choices. He stared at his trembling hands and felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not just fear, humiliation. Not because he'd been caught, but because a part of him had believed he wouldn't be. He had spent his entire career walking just close enough to the line to get away with things. He had silenced his conscience so many times, he'd almost forgotten what it sounded like. But now, in that quiet room with the headlines echoing outside, the truth was louder than anything else. Angela stepped in, alone. She had requested a private meeting, not out of obligation, but because some moments required a human reckoning, not just a legal one. He stood immediately, unsure of what to do with his hands, his posture, or his eyes. "Ma'am," he started, voice low, ragged. She raised a hand. "Sit." He obeyed. There was a long silence, but it wasn't awkward. It was heavy, dense with all the unspoken truths between them. "I didn't come here to destroy you," she said finally, her voice quiet but filled with power. "I could have. Some might even say I should have. But that wouldn't change what matters." He stared at her, ashamed. "Then why did you come?" "Because I needed you to understand something," she said, taking a seat across from him. "You didn't just arrest a woman that morning. You arrested your own humanity. You threw it in the back of your cruiser, locked it behind procedure, and drove away. And you've done it before. Maybe not this publicly. Maybe not to someone with my title. But I know, you know, it wasn't the first time." He closed his eyes. His voice broke. "It wasn't." Angela nodded slowly, as if confirming what she had always suspected. "You weren't born like this. No one is. Something in you allowed it. Cultivated it. And something in your department let it grow." He looked at her with eyes that were no longer proud, but pleading. "I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if I can." She leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Maybe you can't fix the past. But you can face it. You can tell the truth. You can stop protecting what's broken. You can help expose it. Not because it'll save your career. That's already gone. But because it might save someone else." He swallowed hard, emotions clashing in his face, guilt, shame, the first glimmer of something close to remorse. "You really think I can do that?" Angela exhaled. "That depends. Do you still think people like me don't belong where I was standing today?" His eyes welled up. "No. I don't. I swear to God I don't." "Then prove it," she said, rising from her seat. "Not to me. I don't need it. Prove it to yourself. And to the people you spent your career pretending didn't matter." She walked to the door, paused, and turned back. "And one more thing, Officer Cutler. Don't mistake my restraint for forgiveness. What I offered today wasn't mercy. It was clarity. Justice isn't about personal revenge. But it is about truth. And from now on, you'll live in it. She left without waiting for a reply. That night, the nation buzzed. News anchors debated. Social media exploded. Protests turned into celebrations in some cities, with people chanting her name not as a symbol of anger, but of balance finally shifting. Angela didn't attend any of the rallies. She sat alone on her porch, watching the night sky flicker with distant lights and possibilities. She held the letter she had written before the hearing and reread it silently. Inside the letter, she had written to the younger version of herself. The girl who watched her father be handcuffed in church. The one who stood outside a courtroom wondering if she'd ever be allowed in. She wrote about legacy. About healing. About how real power was the ability to speak when you were told to be silent, and to listen when others finally found their voice. Meanwhile, Brian found himself sitting in front of a camera. A local news station had requested an interview. At first, he had refused. But something shifted. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was the conversation he couldn't forget. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time, someone had looked him in the eye and seen through everything. He spoke plainly. No excuses. No PR spin. Just the truth. He talked about the arrest, the assumptions, the prejudice he hadn't even admitted to himself. He acknowledged his past, the complaints, the culture that enabled him. And then, for the first time, he said her name, not with bitterness, but reverence. Justice Harmon, he said, held me accountable without hate. She stripped me of every shield I had and left me no choice but to see who I really was. And what I saw, wasn't a man I want to be anymore. The clip went viral. Not because it absolved him. But because it was real. Raw. A public confession without a courtroom. Angela didn't comment. She didn't need to. The work had already begun. The task force launched its first audit the following week. Policies were challenged. Cases reopened. Officers previously protected by silence were being scrutinized. And everywhere, her name became a signal that no title, no uniform, no tradition would be enough to escape accountability anymore. In her chambers, Angela sat across from a young law clerk named Malik, one of her brightest protégés. He asked the question many had been wondering. How did you stay so calm, he said, eyes wide with admiration. How did you not explode in that courtroom? Angela smiled faintly. Because anger is easy, she said. But justice is patient. It waits for the right moment to be seen. To be heard. And when it finally arrives, it doesn't need to shout. The clerk nodded slowly, absorbing every word. He understood now that justice wasn't loud or vengeful. It was deliberate. It was human. It was hers. And as she leaned back in her chair, eyes scanning the ceiling of her office, she whispered the words she had carried for decades. This is what my father deserved. A single tear slipped down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense that maybe, finally, she had changed something. The pain of that handcuff scar was still faintly visible on her wrist. But it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a mark of victory. Outside the courthouse, the echoes of applause, protest, and disbelief still lingered in the city's air like distant thunder refusing to fade. While the headlines shifted from outrage to reform, and while think pieces flooded every media outlet, dissecting every word she had spoken in that hearing, Angela Harmon found herself in a quieter place. The reverb of her decision, of the commission's unanimous vote and the evidence released against Brian Cutler, had begun to ripple through the very systems she had spent her life trying to fix. But the calm that followed wasn't a soothing silence, it was the kind that comes right before another wave, one that forces you to ask not just whether justice was done, but whether justice is ever enough when the damage has already been done. The commission moved swiftly. It wasn't symbolic action. It was real, structured, dangerous to those who had depended on the shadows of bureaucracy for protection. Departments that had once buried misconduct behind legalese and internal memos were now forced to open their records to public scrutiny. A few officers resigned preemptively, others protested what they called a witch hunt, and many, quietly, expressed relief that something was finally being done. But even as some structures started to shift, resistance found its footing. Politicians began questioning the legitimacy of the task force, media pundits accused the commission of overreach, and the police union filed an injunction to delay the criminal proceedings against Brian. Angela, in her office late one evening, read through the petition papers without emotion. She was used to pushback. What struck her most was the tone of the language, detached, clinical, hollow of any acknowledgement of what had happened. There was no mention of the arrest, the footage, the systemic pattern, or the years of complaints. It was written as if she had simply embarrassed a man, and now, vengeance was being masked as justice. She placed the file down slowly, her eyes drifting toward the window. The city lights below blinked in and out like quiet signals in the night. She knew that change, real change, doesn't come without discomfort. And that discomfort was now manifesting in people calling for her recusal, questioning her impartiality, hinting that her judgment was clouded by personal experience. As if personal experience with injustice somehow disqualified you from fighting it. Meanwhile, Brian sat alone in a mandated ethics rehabilitation program for former officers. The room was stale, the chairs uncomfortable, the air heavy with defensiveness and awkward silence. He had chosen to participate publicly instead of retreating from the spotlight. At first, it was strategy, an attempt to redeem his image. But each session unraveled him more. He listened to the stories of community members who had been profiled, detained, beaten. Stories he had dismissed as exaggerations before. He listened because he couldn't look away anymore. One evening, a young man named Corey, no older than 25, looked at Brian across the circle and asked, "What's it like knowing the only reason you're being held accountable is because the woman you handcuffed had power?" Brian didn't answer right away. He sat there, the weight of the question pressing into his chest. Eventually, he spoke. "It's a nightmare. Because it means every time I didn't get caught, someone without power suffered alone. And I never even stopped to think about it." The group was silent. For once, there was no rebuttal. No defense. Just the beginning of something resembling truth. Back in Washington, Angela was faced with a decision far more complex than anything she'd ruled on in the courtroom. A confidential report had arrived from one of the internal review branches under her task force. It wasn't about Brian, but it stemmed from the review of his precinct. It detailed an embedded network of corruption, falsified evidence, fabricated arrests, and an entire chain of approval that stretched well beyond local officers. Some of those names led to donors. Others, to judges. One of them, painfully, to a colleague she had once mentored in the federal court. If she moved forward with full exposure, it would unleash a storm that could dismantle an entire section of the justice system, costing careers, exposing powerful names. If she chose discretion, the system would remain intact, but so would the silence. She sat with her chief advisor, Malik, who read the report and looked up with tension behind his eyes. "This is the moment," he said carefully. "If we release this, it's not just about reform anymore. It's war." Angela closed her eyes. "I know." He leaned forward. "You always say justice should never be personal. But now it is. You started this because of what happened to you. They're going to say you're biased. That you're burning it all down to get even." She looked at him and said, "Then let them say it." For the first time, she doubted whether the public would stand with her if she took that next step. The country liked its heroes clean, its stories simple. They had rallied behind her arrest, behind the obvious wrong done to her. But this was different. This wasn't one bad cop. It was dozens of names. Years of corruption. It was systems. It was the very foundation. Still, She made the call. At a press conference the next morning, standing behind a podium marked with the seal of the commission, Angela read the opening paragraph of the report out loud. The room fell into stunned silence. She didn't flinch. She didn't deliver it with drama. She delivered it with fact. Clear. Precise. The way justice should be. She announced the full release of the report and the beginning of a federal investigation into every name listed. When the questions exploded from the press, she answered them all with the calm of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for this exact moment. The fallout was immediate. Some cheered. Others raged. The integrity of the commission was questioned in multiple states. Threats were sent to her office. But the truth was out. And the truth, once seen, doesn't return quietly to the dark. Brian, watching the broadcast from the program facility, felt something crack inside him. Not guilt this time. Not even fear. Something more complicated. He knew some of the names in that report. He had eaten lunch with them. He had shaken their hands. He had once believed they were just doing their jobs. And now he saw it clearly. The system hadn't just enabled him. It had recruited him. He reached out, requesting to testify again, not as a defendant, but as a witness. Angela received the request the same evening. Malik asked if she wanted to decline. She shook her head. No. Let him speak. Let them all speak. In her private moments, though, Angela felt the toll. The sleepless nights. The ache in her bones. The weight of decisions that were no longer legal but existential. She wasn't just fighting misconduct. She was challenging the very identity of institutions that had resisted scrutiny for decades. But she never let it show. She knew her presence alone made some people uncomfortable. That was her power. And her burden. One night, after another long session with victims giving testimony about cases that had been closed without cause, she stood alone in the task force's archive room. Row after row of files, names, complaints, sealed reports, some of which she recognized, others she didn't. She ran her fingers across the spines of the folders and whispered to no one, all these voices, waiting. She promised herself then that none of them would wait any longer. The country was shifting. Not easily. Not without resistance. But something had broken open, and from the cracks, voices were rising. Voices like Corey's. Like Angela's father's. Like every person who had been dismissed, ignored, or erased by systems that now found themselves under a microscope. And in the center of it all was the woman who had once been handcuffed for daring to walk through the front door of her own courtroom. But now, there was one more question Angela had to answer. What happens when justice stops being enough? That answer was coming. Angela sat behind her desk with the same calm exterior that had carried her through courtrooms, political interrogations, televised hearings, and now, the most pivotal reform campaign in recent American history. But tonight, the calm didn't feel empowering, it felt necessary. A defense mechanism. Her office was quiet, dark except for the faint desk lamp casting soft gold across piles of documents and handwritten notes. The windows framed the Washington skyline like a silent witness to everything that had come before and all that was about to come undone. She looked down at the updated list. 37 names now. 37 high-ranking individuals, officers, supervisors, judges, prosecutors, whose names were flagged in the federal investigation her task force had ignited. Every name a fracture in the spine of a system that had carried its weight through denial. She ran her fingers along the edge of the file belonging to Judge Keller, her former mentor and colleague. He had given her her first clerkship when she was in her 20s. He had written one of her recommendations for the federal bench. He had even attended her Supreme Court confirmation. And yet, there it was in black ink, 3 redacted complaints, a pattern of case interference, a flag for conflict of interest with a private prison contractor. Angela sat still, eyes fixed on the name, but her mind miles away, back to a time when she believed in untouchable ideals, when men like Keller were just architects of justice, not manipulators of it. The knock on the door was soft but deliberate. Malik entered, his expression grave. He was holding a printout in his hand and didn't sit down. "They're calling for your resignation," he said plainly, no preamble, no sugarcoating. Angela raised her eyes slowly. "Who?" He sighed. "3 senators. 1 judge from the Ninth Circuit. And the National Law Enforcement Officers Association. They're claiming conflict of interest, political bias, personal vendetta. They say you're too emotionally involved to lead an impartial reform." She leaned back, her jaw tightening. "They think justice only counts when it's disconnected from lived experience. They want a referee, not someone who's bled." Malik nodded. "They're moving fast. There's talk of calling an emergency vote in the Senate Judiciary Committee to review the authority of the task force." Angela stood, walking to the window, letting her gaze rest on the scattered lights across the city. She spoke without looking back. "If they come for me, let them. But make sure they know this isn't about me anymore. Make them understand that this is bigger than any one person." He hesitated. "And what if they succeed? What if they strip the task force before the full reports are released?" She turned, her voice sharp now. "Then we release them ourselves. We leak it. Every document. Every complaint. Let the public see what their silence has cost." Malik studied her for a moment before nodding slowly. "We're not going to back down, are we?" She met his eyes. "No. We never were." Elsewhere, in a modest home just outside Baltimore, Brian Cutler sat across from an ethics board representative in a small, sparsely furnished room. The overhead light flickered slightly, the air buzzing with the low hum of tension. He had requested to be heard again, not as a defendant or a symbol, but as someone who had been part of the rot and now wanted to help pull it out from the inside. The board member, a woman named Latrice Hill, listened intently as he recounted not just his own story, but the names he had recognized in Angela's report. He didn't deflect or justify. He confessed. With trembling hands and a voice that cracked more than once, he admitted to conversations he had overheard, reports he had falsified, jokes he had laughed at that were never jokes at all. When he finished, Latrice leaned forward. "Do you understand the consequences of what you're doing?" He nodded. "I do. People will say this is just self-preservation. A stunt." "I don't care what they say," Brian replied. "I cared too much about the wrong opinions for too long. Now I just want to do something that matters, even if it comes too late." She looked at him for a long time, her silence both contemplative and cautious. Finally, she said, "You'll be called to testify again, this time not just about your actions, but the system around you. And if you lie, or omit, or spin, that'll be the end of it." "I won't lie," he whispered. "Not again." Angela received the notice of his request the following day. When she read the outline of what he intended to testify to, a strange stillness settled over her. Not satisfaction. Not victory. Just a quiet sense that perhaps the truth had finally begun to loosen the dam. Still, the opposition didn't rest. The media barrage intensified. Opinion pieces questioned whether Angela's continued role in the task force would undermine its credibility. Political cartoons began circulating, painting her as a radical cloaked in robes. Threats became more specific, emails, letters, voicemails warning her to step down. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she called for a public address. The auditorium was filled within an hour. Cameras lined the back walls. Protesters shouted from both sides of the street. Some held signs with her face on them, half halo, half target. When Angela stepped onto the stage, there was no dramatic fanfare, no teleprompter. She stood alone, steady, unshaken. She began by telling a story, not about her arrest, or the hearing, but about her first courtroom as a public defender. About a 13-year-old boy named Isaiah who was arrested for stealing a sandwich. She described how he had been dragged by his collar into a holding cell, left there for hours without food, and eventually offered a plea deal just to get out. No record of the bruises on his arms. No accountability for the officers who had laughed as they booked him. That boy, she said, never came back to court. He never got a second chance. She still remembered his eyes. Then she paused, looked straight into the cameras, and said, "What we're doing here isn't political. It's personal. Because injustice has always been personal to those who live it. And if my story, my pain, my truth disqualifies me from demanding change, then maybe the system never wanted justice. Maybe it just wanted quiet." The room erupted in applause. Some stood. Others cried. Later that evening, in the privacy of her office, Angela received a message. It was from the daughter of a man named Leonard Briggs, a former officer who had been removed from duty after a reopened case linked him to falsified evidence and forced confessions. The daughter's message wasn't hateful. It was conflicted. She wrote, "I grew up believing my father was a hero. But now I don't know what to believe. I watched your hearing. I read the report. I want to hate you, but part of me thinks maybe you're saving people like me too. People who were lied to about what justice is." Angela read the message twice, then folded it and placed it in the drawer alongside the letter to her younger self. Because justice, she realized, doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes, it looks like awakening. That night, she walked through the nearly empty halls of the federal building, past portraits of former justices, most of them white, most of them men. Her footsteps echoed softly, reverently. She paused in front of her own portrait, still covered with the ceremonial cloth waiting for the unveiling later that year. She stood there for a long time, not because she needed to see her face on a wall, but because she wanted to remember that she hadn't arrived at this place alone. Every name in those files. Every story. Every voice silenced for decades. They were all with her now. The vote to dismantle the task force was scheduled for the following week. The outcome uncertain. But Angela wasn't afraid. She had already won something far greater than a position or a title. She had cracked the silence. And now, it was up to the world to decide whether it would listen. The week of the vote arrived cloaked in a kind of quiet anxiety that didn't speak loudly but weighed heavily on everyone involved. The halls of Congress buzzed with reporters speculating on the outcome, camera crews staking out the entrances for a glimpse of the major players. Angela remained mostly out of sight, not because she was hiding, but because she had learned a long time ago that silence could speak more forcefully than noise. Her team was prepared. The documents had been submitted. The testimony lined up. The transparency they fought for was now part of the public record. There were no more secrets to leverage, no more time for strategic maneuvers. It was simply a matter of whether the truth could hold its own in a room full of power. Angela sat with Malik in a quiet conference room just across the street from the Capitol. The windows overlooked a gray sky, thick with clouds and stillness. She was reviewing her notes for what might be her final address as head of the task force. Malik sat across from her, tapping a pen nervously, eyes darting from her to the time on his phone. Neither of them had spoken for several minutes. Then, finally, he asked the question that had been looming in his throat for days. "What if they vote us out?" Angela didn't look up. She closed the folder in front of her, folded her hands, and said softly, "Then we go back to the beginning. We rebuild." He looked at her, frustrated. "But that's not fair. You did everything right. We did everything right." Angela met his eyes, and her voice was full of something deeper than frustration, resolve. "You think I didn't know this could happen? You think I haven't been in rooms full of men who smile at me while they sharpen their knives under the table? This isn't about fairness. It's about endurance. Truth isn't a headline, Malik. It's a seed. Sometimes it grows quietly." He leaned back, the fight in him struggling against the fatigue. But how do you keep doing this? After everything? Angela's voice softened. Because someone has to. Because I remember what it feels like to walk into a courtroom and know no one believes you belong there. Because every time I sit in front of that microphone, I'm speaking for a mother who buried her son and never got an answer. That's how I keep doing it. The room was silent again, but not empty. Later that day, as the Senate hearing was set to begin, Angela walked through the corridors of the Capitol with measured steps. There was no rush, no grand entourage. Just her and Malik, walking side by side, their shoes echoing against the marble. Senators moved past them, some offering curt nods, others avoiding eye contact entirely. It wasn't personal. It was political. But Angela had long since stopped expecting grace from those who had never been asked to bleed for what they stood for. When she entered the chamber, the room quieted. Her seat was placed at the far end of the long, curved table. Before her sat a panel of lawmakers who held the power to continue her work or dismantle it. The chairperson called the session to order, his voice flat with formality. Angela folded her hands, waited for her name to be called, and when it was, she stood without hesitation. She didn't bring papers. She didn't read a script. She spoke plainly, from the truth she had carried with her for over 70 years. I'm not here to defend my character. That's already been judged, by far greater courts than this one. I'm not here to appeal for mercy or power. I'm here to ask one question: who are we without accountability? When someone takes an oath to uphold the law, and instead uses it as a weapon against the voiceless, and the system protects them, what does that say about the rest of us? The panel listened, some with skepticism, some with guilt, and one or two with genuine reflection. Angela continued. This task force wasn't created out of ideology. It was born from necessity. From silence. From fear. From the stories that died in holding cells and behind court doors. If you vote to dissolve us, you won't be ending a project, you'll be extinguishing a light that was just beginning to reach the dark corners of our justice system. But the truth will not vanish with your vote. It's already out. It lives in the stories we've released, the files we've opened, the voices that were never meant to be heard. As she finished, the room remained quiet. No applause. No immediate reaction. Just stillness, the kind that wraps around people when they know something has been said that cannot be undone. When she stepped down, Malik placed a hand gently on her shoulder. You said it all, he whispered. Angela exhaled, not with relief, but with closure. Now let them decide who they are. Across town, in a modest building in Northwest D.C., Brian Cutler sat with a reporter from a major national outlet. The segment was scheduled to air live, and his decision to speak again was met with backlash from former colleagues and even family. But he knew that if he remained silent, his entire attempt at change would mean nothing. The interviewer asked him what had changed in him, what made him come forward now, after so many years of complicity. He answered simply, the day I saw her walk into that courtroom and not look at me with rage, but with responsibility, I realized I had two choices. Pretend I hadn't seen the truth, or follow it. Even if it destroyed what little I had left. The interviewer paused. And do you think people will believe your redemption? Brian shook his head. I don't know. But redemption isn't for me to believe in. It's for me to earn. One truth at a time. That night, just hours before the Senate vote, Angela returned to her home. The street was quiet, the sky heavy with the kind of clouds that held back thunder until the perfect moment. She sat on her porch, hands resting on her lap, and waited. Malik had promised to call as soon as the results were announced. She didn't pace. She didn't check the news. She simply watched the horizon, as if waiting for the wind to tell her what would come. The phone rang at 11:03 p.m. She answered without a word. They voted, Malik said, his voice unreadable. Angela didn't speak. They tried everything. Debates. motions. Even a recess to delay. But in the end, it passed. By one vote. 1. She closed her eyes. Her throat tightened. Not in celebration. Not in victory. In weight. In responsibility. "Thank you," she said softly. "For standing with me." Malik exhaled on the other end, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "We keep going." Angela whispered, "Yes. We keep going." And then the wind picked up, gentle at first, then stronger, pushing through the trees, brushing past her face, and carrying with it the sound of a country that, for one moment, had chosen truth. But somewhere in her heart, she knew this was not the end of the battle. It was only the breath between storms. Months passed and the work of the task force deepened, not just in reach but in impact. Police departments across the country began re-examining their training protocols, not because of pressure from the top, but because their communities were now demanding it with renewed force. Civilian oversight boards, once symbolic, were now being given teeth. Old cases were reopened, victims recontacted, and in some instances, settlements were issued quietly with apologies that had taken decades to arrive. The truth Angela had helped crack open had rippled far beyond the courtroom or congressional halls. It had reached the neighborhoods where fear had once worn a badge and silence had worn a uniform. Angela remained the public face of this shift, but she chose a quieter presence than expected. She declined television interviews. She rarely made speeches. She preferred to sit with families in community centers, to attend roundtables with young activists, to stand in back rows of town halls and simply listen. She understood that legacy wasn't measured in applause but in what remained when the noise faded. One afternoon, at a small gathering in Detroit, a boy no older than 11 approached her after a panel. He held a small notepad and asked shyly if she would sign it. When she bent down and asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, he didn't say lawyer or judge. He said, truth teller. And she smiled, tears in her eyes, because that was all she had ever really tried to be. Brian Cutler, whose name had once sparked outrage, slowly disappeared from the headlines. But he didn't return to obscurity. Instead, he continued his testimony tour, not for sympathy, but for education. He spoke to police academies, to ethics classes, to rooms filled with officers who didn't want to hear what he had to say, until they did. He never painted himself as a hero. He never asked for forgiveness. What he offered was raw, uncomfortable honesty. The first time he visited a youth center in Philadelphia, a young man asked him why people like him never change until it's too late. Brian had no clever answer. He just said, because sometimes it takes losing everything to realize what you never deserved to have in the first place. That kind of vulnerability, repeated over time, began to do something no punishment could. It created space for real conversations, for difficult truths, for the slow, uneven path toward trust. Malik, once Angela's advisor, stepped into a larger role. With Angela's encouragement, he launched a new nonprofit legal initiative aimed at bringing community-driven reform directly into cities most affected by policing abuse. His organization partnered with local schools, mental health advocates, and public defenders to create a network that provided not just reactionary legal help, but proactive education and support. In his office hung a single photo, Angela, seated at her desk, looking out a window, a caption underneath that read, "Keep going." As for Angela, her story took a turn few expected. After a full year of continued leadership, she stepped down from the commission voluntarily. Not under pressure. Not from scandal. But from clarity. She had done what she was meant to do there. The system had been forced to look at itself. It would never be perfect. But it had been touched by truth, and truth had a way of staying even when people left. She returned to teaching, accepting a position at Howard University, the very place that had once given her a voice. She taught constitutional law, civil rights history, and most importantly, the ethics of justice. Her classroom wasn't filled with wide-eyed kids hoping to become politicians. It was filled with warriors of quiet courage, students who understood that change didn't always come from the loudest voice in the room but from the most grounded. Her final lecture of the semester drew hundreds. Cameras weren't allowed. Phones were off. In a room full of future leaders, Angela spoke with no script, no notes. She talked about the difference between law and justice, between punishment and accountability. She told them about the day she almost let anger become her mission, and how choosing integrity instead didn't make her weaker, but unstoppable. At the end, she said only one thing that felt like a goodbye. Remember, she told them, her voice low, you are not here to be liked. You are here to be unignorable. And then she smiled, nodded, and walked off the stage with the grace of someone who had not just survived the system but reshaped it. So now, to you, who have listened this far, who have sat with every twist, every tear, every betrayal and redemption, what will you do with this story? Because this was never just about Angela. It wasn't even just about Brian. It's about the moments where silence feels safer than truth, when justice costs more than comfort, when dignity must be defended even if no one is watching. It's about asking yourself, what systems do I uphold? What voices have I ignored? And what am I willing to risk to change any of it? Angela Harmon's story is finished here. But the truth she lived by is not. It moves now in the hands of those who were watching, those who were listening. Maybe in your hands. Maybe in your voice. So tell me, what do you believe justice looks like? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let this be a space where voices echo louder than silence. And if this story moved you, challenged you, made you feel something real, subscribe to Tales of Twist. There are more truths to tell. More battles to face. And more voices like Angela's that refuse to be forgotten.